And if that's a problem at all, please let us know, or ask your question privately if you don't want to make it publicly, etc. Okay. I believe there is a recording in progress. Okay, so I will properly introduce Martin now. Okay.
Okay, I hope everyone can see me. It seems that my camera is on, the microphone seems to be working, so I'm simply going to assume that this is the case and continue. Thank you, Lucy, for confirming this. So, and thank you very much, the other Lucy, Mayblin, for taking part of this project and for hosting us here at this online book launch at the Migration Research Group at Sheffield University. It's such an honor to be here and to take part in the first event of this season at your very exciting research environment. Also thank you, of course, for all the contributors who will share their findings and analysis with us later. I'm looking so much forward to it. I've promised Lucy I can do this in no more than 15 minutes. I'm going to try to do it in even less, 10. So now I've set this goal, and that is because I hope we can have some lively discussions at the end. But I have sort of bracketed my intervention, my introduction here along 5 headlines. The first is the contribution, what this edited volume sets out to do. Then there's 2 different points of barriers that I'm going to talk about, what the volume seeks to address. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the potential at a disciplinary level, and finally allude to what everyone probably in this virtual space is aware of, is also a controversial and contentious space of post-colonial arguments surrounding forced migration. But to dive into the first, so this volume is called Postcoloniality and Forced Migration, and as Lucy referenced, this came through discussions of a workshop that I was so lucky to host in Copenhagen. And the idea that we sort of conversed around here is that there was value in conceptualizing the links between colonial era governance and the present in forced migration as post-coloniality. And this meaning not something, a relic of the past or a page to be turned on history, but rather the ongoing and constitutive effects of different colonial encounters as they have converged into the present moment. And of course, we were all discussing a great deal of different literatures, from C.L.R. James to Leela Gandhi to Stoller, etc. But really what we also conversed on was the need to do this across different disciplines. And then we were all very empirical. And so we were discussing, well, first of all, that the claim of post-coloniality should not be understood as colonial territories not existing anymore. This is not the case. And actually, you can see that the Caribbean is the world's least decolonized territory, where the European Union, for instance, has many so-called overseas territories. For instance, the European Space Agency has its launch site in French Guinea, which is actually located in South America. So there's great caution to be had when we talk about this. Still, we found this to be a very useful sort of intervention, a way of opening it up. But we're also facing some barriers when it comes to translating what is already a rich literature in other disciplines on post-coloniality and decoloniality when coming into the studies of refugee and forced migration. Maybe one of the reasons could be that this discipline has a quite intimate relation to both policy and law. And sometimes this means that it mirrors the kind of active forgetting of certain context, of certain displacements, and also that it reinforces and restates certain myths of difference, as called by B.S. Chimney. So there is maybe a tendency to speak of forced migration governance as something coming into place after the 1951 convention, of a sort of a year zero approach, maybe sometimes into the interwar years, but often not very further than this. And this year zero approach, I think we all agreed from our different knowledge points, is very unsatisfactory. But it is something that we often re-experience in forced migration studies as another humanitarian crisis followed by displacement sets in, and everyone trains their eyes on this, forgetting what has come in even the recent past, but certainly also in the colonial past. So, for instance, there are very constitutive myths about how the French revolutions brought around the Declaration of Human Rights, etc. Yet the formative role of the Haitian Revolution, which happened and began in the same year, is often completely relegated to the trenches of history. Or the concept of crimes against humanity is often brought back to the post-World War II Nuremberg trials, forgetting the century of mixed commission courts that actually is arguably by Jenny Martinez and others has a formative role in the freeing of captive in the transatlantic slave trade, where this sort of case law emerged. So there's a century that's somehow missing from these formative myths. There are also some other barriers that this translates into, and this is the second kind of barriers, and that has to do with the fact that if we open our gaze to the vast empirical data collected during colonial times, that is, we translate colonial archives into a repository to study forced migration events, then actually there is the basis to establish a lot of comparisons between current and already existing colonial cases and events of forced displacement. And this is Hansen back in 1996 who said in a general way about history that lacking this kind of comparison may bypass parallels, policy lessons, and theoretical advances. Now, of course, there is a technological, perhaps even acceleration that has occurred from the colonial era and to today, yet we might actually find that many of the practices are not that different, maybe even very similar, and there might be a lot of lessons to be learned from opening our gaze to this past. This is also what Lucy Mayblin has done in her brilliant work from 17 and recently also with Turner in 21. And this is also notably what is so exciting, if I may completely unbiased say so, in this edited volume, because all of the contributors are from their own vantage point of knowledge, discipline, perspective, unfolding this kind of richness through the case studies. So this is why the book is attempted to be a very interesting intervention in this direction. So if we follow this train of thought, then we decenter the sort of Eurocentric narrative concerning the notion of a refugee, to seek refuge, what it means to offer protection, who offers protection, which in some ways can be seen as formative notions of modernity. So this kind of postcoloniality interventions can be seen as a way to decenter the stage for modernity, relocating it not only in the territories colonized by Europe, but also very much in the interactions, in the relations formed through these colonial encounters, the legacies of which continue to endure today. We can name many: humanitarian governance, suppressionist border control, the US domestic slave trade, the British Empire in Asia, even US concentration camps in Philippines or the British ones in South Africa. There are lots of examples and very interesting cases to dive into. But of course, this also faces certain disciplinary issues. So one barrier to be faced is, of course, this maybe refusal or even deeming of irrelevance of looking at colonial encounters for current day predicaments. But there is also a need to take interdisciplinarity serious. And this is also why this book is comprised by so many contributors, why there are editors from many different disciplines, and why contributors from different disciplines have also interacted. And that also, I think, have led to some very interesting results. Now, finally, as we also deal with in the introduction of the book, this is by no means uncontroversial. There is, in a way, a funny or remarkable duality or even self-contradiction in the critique facing post-colonial studies of forced migration. One being that it is irrelevant, no longer necessary, but another one is inflammatory attacks, such as in France, where post-colonial studies and migration studies have been labeled as a form of gangrene, which has to be amputated from French society. So if nothing else, those kinds of really incendiary language shows us the relevance of post-colonial interventions and why it is so necessary that refugee and forced migration studies also follow through on the emerging literature that this book seeks to inscribe itself into. And I think that was probably what I was going to say as an introduction. I'm looking very much forward to hear the contributors speak next.
Thank you, Martin, very much for introducing. You didn't introduce yourself, I know. I don't think, and where you're based now at Amnesty International and previously the University of Aalborg when this book was conceived. Okay, we'll wait for questions till the end and we'll move on now to the first speakers, Clayton, Nina and Elsa. I believe Clayton is going to present. We are loading your PowerPoint now. So yeah, over to you.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay. Excellent. So yeah, I'm Clayton Boeyink. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Edinburgh, the Center of African Studies and Social Anthropology. So before launching into our chapter, I wanted to pull back the curtain a bit to explain how the publication came to be. So at the end of our very productive and energizing workshop in Denmark, we were deciding the next steps, and Martin and the other more established scholars made a very strong commitment to the early career scholars like myself and those from the Global South to have publishing and editing possibilities as a result of the papers at the workshop. So first, I wanted to say thank you to them, as this is not how usually these workshops play out. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity, but I'm also explaining this because this publication strategy is also how this chapter came to be. So as the publishing plans were put together, a lot of the presenters were paired together based on clear themes, like Rosanne and Sharla's chapter on the slave trade, or Mathias and Martin's chapter on Libya. So Nina, Elsa, and I were kind of the odd ones out without clear pairings. So we had to find a way to make the chapter work, which I'm glad happened because they're such brilliant researchers and very enjoyable co-authors. So Suta and Malila and Mayat obviously link well together. The colonial tentacles are all over these enclaves and outposts, as you will see later in the presentation. The case of Tanzania, which I'll present, makes these a bit strange bedfellows and odd pairings at first glance. After all, Tanzania, it gained independence in the early 1960s, didn't have a massive white settler population like Algeria, Kenya, or South Africa. And the founding father, Julius Nyerere, was a staunch anti-colonial and Pan-African leader who helped forge the Organization of African Unity. So it seemed on the surface that they were quite successful in resisting and severing colonial ties. However, as we discussed our cases together, we decided that these disparate geographies and histories, which were and continue to be subject to Spanish, French, German, and British colonial and neo-colonial rule, they were worth bringing together in analysis precisely because of these differences. This allows us to see the totalizing nature of coloniality that still exists, even in an independent state like Tanzania. So we build on Quijano and Gutierrez Rodriguez to mobilize the notion of the coloniality of migration. However, a lot of the scholarship kind of engaging with this theory on the exclusionary and racialized immigration policies focused on the global north, such as Europe, US, Australia. So we wanted to join others to explore the coloniality of migration in current and former colonies in Africa. So our three cases, in spite of local specificities, the colonial legacies of mobility management appear in all cases in contemporary migration policies. Reviewing mobility-related practices such as collective refoulement, massive forced removals, and strict encampment, we aim to debunk the narrative of exceptionalism that is often associated with such policies and oftentimes mobilized to legitimate harsh measures and strict regulations, but rather they're patterns of the continuity stemming from colonialism. So our case studies hint that colonial and pre-colonial orders are entangled in the production of contemporary racialized hierarchies and their attached inequalities. So you can move to the next slide of Tanzania. So I'll start with a quote from a Burundian refugee that I heard while doing my PhD fieldwork that really stuck with me. So he said, if a Congolese and a Burundian are on a bus and a police stop them, then a Burundian will be taken off and the Congolese can continue on. Burundi has a bad image in Tanzania. The bad image is attached for a long time. Burundians are highly attached to the war from before. All are labeled as bad or dangerous people. So I don't have a lot of space to go over the background information, but as the quote suggests, the two main refugee populations in Tanzania are from the DR Congo and Burundi, and are forced to live in camps without the freedom of movement or employment. So while relations between the two groups are cordial, if you spend time in the camps and surrounding areas, there's a distinct xenophobic attitude toward Burundians, but not Congolese, which I argue that it draws from a long racialized history of border control and hierarchization, where Burundian migrants were confined to the lowest class rung on colonial plantations. Burundians today are called dirty, or they're even referred to as tractors because of the menial agriculture labor that they are famous for. So this colonial labor and mobility regime is important because it was central to the colonial project of extracting labor and resources, which is enabled by racist ideology. To mobilize wealth for the colony, you have to mobilize people. During colonialism, this occurred through past laws, taxes, which forced people to move to find work or live in labor reserved in tribal homelands. This creates racialized territories where people could be pushed in and contained or pushed out of as capital and labor demanded. First, the Germans and later British both carried out these containment and mobility regimes, and the British even set up labor camps in the borderlands for neighboring Burundi labor migrants fleeing forced labor by Belgian colonists. So these camps closely resemble the camps that exist today. In other words, migration and labor relations toward neighboring Burundi built under colonialism have been recurrent features of the ethno-racialized attitudes and refugee policies which are punishing Burundian refugees today. So as I mentioned, Julius Nyerere is and should be considered an anti-colonial statesman. His mobility controls of both Tanzanian citizens and migrants and refugees closely resembled the colonial models of encampment and labor exploitation and resource extraction. The state uncritically accepted the adopted colonial borders and in many ways made them more rigid through the Tanzanian National Project. Refugees from the Great Lakes that were once seen as intertwined cultures were seen as a development opportunity and a security threat. So I don't have the space here to go into all the detail that the chapter in the book does to draw comparisons, but so I encourage you to check out the book if you can. So, but in more recent years, encampment and border enforcement has continued to harden and harshen with the designs to punish Burundians so that they leave the country, which also mirrors the two cases that will follow and are presented by Nina. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Clayton. Can you all hear me? Is this working? Perfect. Okay, so I will be presenting the two other cases. Thank you very much, Clayton, for explaining how we came to work together on this. I also would like to thank Martin for suggesting this collaboration, which I think has been very stimulating and productive. I would like also to apologize because we were moved forward in the lineup of a chapter presentation so that Elsa can say a couple of words, but unfortunately she had also a last minute impeachment and couldn't join us. So what I will do is that I will first present Elsa's contributions on Ceuta and Melilla, reading a couple of extracts from the chapter, and then I will move on to presenting the Mayotte case studies on which I have worked. I don't know if you can also see the PowerPoint. I hope you can. I'm not used to this platform. Okay, so let's start with the case study of Ceuta and Melilla. Elsa started her section with a quote from a colonel of the Guardia Civil that she interviewed in 2015, and I think it's interesting to mention here. So this colonel of the Guardia Civil said the objective of the Guardia Civil is to save the integrity of the Spanish border and that of Europe. It is Europe that must go to Africa, not Africa to Europe. They need to be taught how to organize. They must be taught democracy, education, and almost by force if necessary. So Elsa argues that it is essential to look back at the long colonial histories of Ceuta and Melilla in order to study the coloniality of the migration control that is in place today in the Spanish enclaves. The contemporary Spanish occupation must be understood initially as the continuation of the struggle against Islam and the Reconquista, this time on the other side of the Straits of Gibraltar. So the Portuguese seized Ceuta in 1415 and Melilla was conquered in 1497, and this became the first Spanish frontera, so to say, so the southern border. In the 1860s, Ceuta and Melilla became the bridgeheads of a colonial penetration in Morocco that led, after several bloody wars against the Riffian resistance, to a dual Spanish and French protectorate at the beginning of the 20th century. The enclaves became plazas de soberanía, so to say, which were then gradually populated by civilians from the Spanish peninsula and Morocco, mostly for economic needs. Apart from a few exceptions of categories of indigenous people useful for the Spanish army or commerce, the Muslim population was banned from the enclaves until the end of the 19th century. Current migration policies implemented in Ceuta and Melilla are often viewed through the prism of their supposed exceptionality. However, both colonial history and field research have prompted us to question the rhetoric of exceptionalism, which ultimately tends to endorse an official discourse and obscure the institutionalization of discretionary and violent practices in the name of defending a Spanish-European border. And this was actually one of the red thread for our chapters, to put this allegedly exceptionalism into context. Back to Elsa's chapter, our research reveals in concrete ways how security and militarized devices and imaginaries of colonial genealogies can be found in the context of contemporary anti-migration policies. Beyond the selective permeability emanating from the border regime of Ceuta and Melilla, real racial filtering is re-established at the border. Previously, the Riffian were the invading enemies. Today, it is mainly the sub-Saharan, in brackets, from Central and West Africa, who are the main target of control at the border. This is based on a racist policy oriented towards tracking down black skin. Until March 2015, there was no written protocol specifying how the Guardia Civil agents were to carry out this mission in practice. It was a matter of carrying out oral orders, intercepting people, generally adult or minors males from Central and West Africa, and systematically carrying out their direct refoulement to Morocco by handing them over to Moroccan militaries. That is, collective refoulement prohibited by national and international law. During these hot returns, as they are called in the Spanish context, carried out at the fence of the enclaves, the undesirable black bodies can be beaten or even killed in continuity with colonial and slave regimes. Indeed, migrant people regularly mobilize this analogy. If some people still manage to cross a militarized border, they become indefinitely trapped in so-called temporary stay centers in the enclaves. As Sanchez showed with the example of Ceuta, the colonial prison function of the banished Cubans in the 19th century was replaced by that of a European barrier, with the colonial and post-colonial link as a common thread. And if the forced migrations of the America-Europe banishment are different from the irregularized Africa-Europe migrations, and if they are not located in the same historical temporality, this points to a continuity in the use of the Ceuta enclave in different modalities as a sort of territory prison for undesired racialized people. Given the militarized means used to dehumanize or even kill to defend the borders of Ceuta and Melilla, it is necessary to understand what the meaning of this violence is, a violence that is tacitly authorized and perpetuated over time to defend the border beyond legal and administrative consideration. According to Gurminder Babra, we must think of colonialism not only as something that states do, but also as something that individuals do. The particular violence inflicted on Black African migrants in the 1990s seems to be aimed at reaffirming a racist but also colonial social order, as illustrated by these remarks of the Guardia Civil colonel. And I'm quoting, "The fence symbolizes the failure of many African countries. It is necessary today." So racial discrimination, first against the reference and then more broadly against the population of Moroccan origin, is constitutive and structural in the enclaves and at its border, and impunity for border guards, yesterday as today, ensures continuity to the violent dominations of Africans trying to penetrate these colonial bastions. Violence is intensifying today for people marked by the color of their skin or their gender. For some, border violence is necessary to safeguard the Spanish civilization and to continue defending what remains of the empire. The coloniality of the migration regime at this Euro-African border is striking, but from being an exception, it must lead us to think in a more global way about the coloniality of the European migration regime. But the everyday attempts of undesired racialized migrants to cross the borders of Ceuta and Melilla, despite all the obstacles imposed on them, also continue a long history of resistance by colonial people who shake up the post-colonial order. And I would like also to briefly mention that since our chapter was written, there was another instance of lethal violence that unfolded at these borders. On 24th of June this year, nationals from Central, West and East Africa attempted to cross the fences of the Spanish enclave of Melilla, and the violent repression resulted in the death of at least 37 people and over 300 injured. And I know that Elsa Tyszler has written a blog post in Contretemps about this, so I recommend it to you, of course. I will now move on to the third case studies in our chapter, the case of Mayotte. So we analyze also in the chapter how in this French overseas department, Comorians are caught up in restrictive migration policies that simultaneously organize their immobilization by making regularization very difficult, as well as their forced mobility through ongoing massive deportations. It's important also to say that Mayotte, an island that's under French jurisdiction in the Indian Ocean, is a territory that is still claimed by the Republic of the Comoros with the formal support of the General Assembly of the United Nations. So after France bought Mayotte in 1841, colonial designs for the island also projected agricultural, commercial successes, but colonial administrators were immediately confronted with a shortage of labor to carry out the anticipated colonial undertakings. So to remedy this situation, colonial authorities authorized the recruitment of indentured laborers from the neighboring Comoran islands, and notably the closest one, which is Anjouan. But contrary to the fate of the Reunion Island, for example, Mayotte did not become a significant destination for laborers. So it is against this background that years after the official abolition of slavery in Mayotte, slave trading on French boats was reported to have continued in the Mozambique Canal, and this was incentivized by labor shortages. So while a combination of geographical and political factors hampered Mayotte from becoming the projected plantation colony, attempts to this end demonstrate how mobility was organized to serve this primary colonial interest. But similarly to the other two case studies in our chapter, the racial hierarchies upon which colonial domination relied continue to shine through in the multidimensional disenfranchisement of Comorian people in Mayotte today. I'd like briefly to quote the American anthropologist Anne Stoller. She wrote, "While it is true that not all forms of social injustice have imperial roots, with European refugee camps, detention centers, and migrant hotspots, it is often possible to track the tangibilities of empire as effective histories of the present." And so in my section of the chapter, I emphasize two dimensions of the contemporary migration regime in Mayotte. On the one hand, the large-scale production of illegality, and on the other hand, the yearly massive deportations. So Mayotte has a population of about 250,000 inhabitants, and about half of this population fall into the category of foreigners, according to French statistical data. So the share of undocumented persons on the island, that's estimated to be about half of this foreigners, is also very high. But contrary to dominant media and political narratives that suggest continuous clandestine arrivals to be the cause of this important share of undocumented persons, a closer look at the trajectories of undocumented women reveals that not only have many resided on the island for long periods of time, they were also afraid to leave out because of a fear of being identified, arrested, or refused re-entry. So in our research, the average length of residence in Mayotte of the 40 women of foreign origin that we interviewed was about 11 years. And several of the women that we met deplored the many barriers to regularization that they face, the complicated access to information, the high costs of these procedures, and the many hurdles even to enter the prefecture building, so it's the administrative building. In 2018, when the services for foreigners were already saturated, the prefecture, for instance, closed its doors for several months, and this made regularization literally impossible. So as a result, undocumented Comorians in Mayotte are stranded on the island with little prospect for regularizations, and they are caught up in the inequalities that are entrenched by the coloniality of migration governance. Migrants in Mayotte are also trapped on the island because even when they are regularized, most types of residency permits delivered in Mayotte are only valid for the island. They do not allow to travel to metropolitan France. And those who hold a residency permit, even though they are legally residing in Mayotte, they need to apply for a visa to travel to metropolitan France or even to another French overseas department. And the difficulties of regularization and the very limited mobility rights it provides testify to a highly hierarchical structure that is designed to limit not only immigration to Mayotte, but also to metropolitan France, while at the same time, metropolitans, people coming from metropolitan France, are free to visit and work in Mayotte as if it were a fully integrated French territory. So this is similar to the logic of colonial expatriates, as metropolitans are incentivized to settle in Mayotte, at least for a few years, through state finance bonuses, pay rises. And the logic of this differentiated rights is interestingly racialized and facilitates the reproduction of social inequalities, with metropolitan expatriates being provided these financial benefits for working in Mayotte, while Comorian migrants face significant restrictions in achieving administrative and economic security. And the local Mahoran population finds itself in a precarious position whereby strengthening the political integration to the French nation seems to translate into increasingly restrictive policies towards Comorians, in spite of the shared linguistic and cultural ties that run across the 4 islands of the Comorian archipelago. And this echoes the example of anti-Black racism that Clayton has just mentioned in the Tanzanian context. And the second dimension of the French migration regime in Mayotte that I explore in the chapter concerns the large-scale forced removals that the French administration carries out. Mayotte breaks French records for the forced removal of people in irregular situation. In 2017, for example, about 25,000 persons were detained in metropolitan France and almost 18,000 in Mayotte. So keeping in mind that Mayotte only represents about 250,000 inhabitants, actually this island accounts for about 70% of the number of detained persons in France in 2017. I see I have only 2 minutes. I will just say two words to conclude. Most of these persons also are actually deported, 95%, because of a specific migration regime whereby deportations are accelerated. The average length of stay in the detention center is only 17 hours. This leaves no room for legally challenging these practices, whereas this is not the case in metropolitan France. So the coloniality of the system lies in the separation of Mayotte from the general roles and rules that apply in France. As a member of a migrants' rights NGO heard from the director of the detention center in Mayotte, there is the law and there is Mayotte. And this statement demonstrates how the conditions of subalternity are reproduced through the rationale of exceptionalism. Reduced to tools of broader geopolitical concerns, undocumented persons in French post-colonial peripheries become instruments of the politics of numbers, and because of that, they are permanently subjected to a hostile climate of potential arrests and deportations. And to conclude, I'll just mention that in this complex configuration, the Mahoran elite has become a strong advocate for ever harsher migration control, enacting racialized relations between Mahorans and Comorians. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Clayton and Nina. I don't know if, Nina, you introduce yourself. I think I might have missed that, but please, speakers, do introduce yourselves. Okay, so the next presentation we're going to hear from Mathias on behalf of, oh no, that's wrong, yes, sorry, we have the right slide up now, from Eva and Leonie talking about their research on Civipol in West Africa.
Yes, so hello everybody. Can you hear me and see me? Yes, okay, good, then I will start. So I would like to start off by really thanking the co-editors and all the authors of the book and for their really wonderful efforts and commitments of this project that has actually lasted for almost 3 years soon. And most of this has actually, putting together the book has happened during a global pandemic and a lockdown. And this has been posing a lot of challenges for many of the authors and their families. So I think it's really impressive that we have managed to arrive here at this book launch. So I am Eva Stambøl. I am a postdoc at the University of Oslo and the Free University of Berlin. And I will be presenting our chapter co-authored with Leonie Jegen, who is University of Amsterdam, and our chapter explores how colonial continuities manifest themselves in European and French policing of mobility, especially in West Africa, and we are looking at processes of modification of such policing and surveillance. So looking at EU and French policing of mobility in West Africa today, we observed one colonial continuity in particular, and that is the blurring between state and corporate interests. So we did this in 3 ways. We were digging through historical literature and secondary historical sources on French colonialism and neocolonialism. And we also based ourselves on our previous fieldworks in West Africa, so in Senegal, Mali, Niger, and Ghana. And we did also follow-up research, online research on today's security industry. And we found that the blurring of public and private, or state and corporate, was important since early French colonization of Africa and beyond, in continued French hegemony after African decolonization, as well as in today's security industry and its role in policing mobility and externalized borders. So 2 concepts help us make sense of surveillance and control, namely revolving credit and revolving doors. So revolving credit is a notion first coined by anti-colonial Pan-African thinker and first president and prime minister of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, and refers to the circulation of capital and aid monies from the metropole through the colonies or the former colonies and back to the metropoles. And revolving doors refers to the circulation of key personalities between public office, internal security, and business. So since early French colonialism in the end of the 15th century, this manifested itself as mercantilism for nearly 300 years, and it was dominated by chartered monopolies that had trading posts along the West African coast. So colonialism was then mainly profitable for these trading companies, whose monopolies were also expected to some extent enforced by the French state. The colonies were not so much profitable for France as for these trading companies, and France then protected their interests. French control in Africa then evolved since the 1860s and between 1860s and 1880s to what has been coined imperial colonialism, which also now included military intervention and the moral imperative, namely the civilizing mission. And this new phase of colonialism also coincided with French transition to industrial capitalism, which gave an impetus to empire building. And the African colonies now came to play a more important role in the development of French industry and economy, among others through the extraction of raw materials, which were important for these industries. So policing of order was also important for the control across the French Empire. And these policing bodies policing was initially a task mainly for the military. But civilian administration and policing bodies developed gradually and based on templates also from metropolitan France, like, for instance, the gendarmerie. And they had also high levels of decentralization and autonomy. And the French policing of order in its African territories were often directly tied to industry and commerce. And this means that the modes and intensity of surveillance were intertwined with the specific political economy of the specific colonies. And research by historian Martin Thomas has highlighted that all European colonial governments actually used the police across Africa to ensure economic extraction, land appropriation, tax collection, and suppression of worker dissent, including the maintenance of order on plantations, in mines, and in processing plants. Many of these were actually run by private and large and powerful European companies. So there also the state was ensuring the interests of these companies. And criminologist Emmanuel Blanchard has uncovered that the understaffing and underfunding of the French colonial police, because they were actually put down to control really enormous territories, led them to use anthropometric identification techniques for the surveillance of populations and mobility, like, for example, forcing people to have an ID, fingerprinting, and other forms of census taking and registration. And in our chapter, we also observe how similar surveillance techniques are used in migration control today, and now also including biometric ones, and how they are developed and implemented by European companies. So after the decolonization of African countries in the 1960s, the French control did not just end. France developed special relationships with many new state leaders and in many ways retained its zone of influence. So politically, this happened through both formal and informal networks. They were often centered around Charles de Gaulle's so-called Monsieur Afrique, Jacques Foccart, and they encompassed public as well as private bodies, personalities and companies, including military elements and people from the secret police. Militarily, France remained the security guarantor of its former colonies and had also retained military bases and pre-positioned forces on West African soil. And economically, since 1945, there has been the CFA franc zone, which economically has maintained the dependency of the former French colonies on their metropole and favored the economic interests of France. So as argued by Bruno Chabonneau, French development aid to Africa has actually been recycled through Africa and sent back to Europe and to France through the order books of French companies. And in our chapter, we show how such revolving credit now also encompasses the recycling of EU aid, and especially that channel to mobility control and internal security concerns. So we then go on to look at a company that has attained an important role in the policing of mobility in Africa today, namely Civipol. So Civipol is the French Ministry of Interior's technical cooperation operator. It is a private company, but its main shareholder is France, for 40%, and it's also co-owned by other major security companies like Thales, Airbus, Morpho, and Défense Conseil International. its stated mission is promoting the sector of the security industries. And one way in which it does so is through Milipol, that you can see here on the picture, which is a fair event for homeland security, which is organized in Paris, Doha, and Singapore, and it displays and sells security equipment to things such as anti-terrorism, border control, and port security. And its main customers are both private companies, but also ministries of interior, administrations of customs, defense, and justice from countries around the world. And Civipol is also developing security and border technologies and training third countries' police and border guards. Civipol is also in case of revolving doors between state and corporate interests. So key personalities heading Civipol have had shifting roles in French ministries, in internal security administration, as well as in the security industry. Like, for example, its chief executive officer, Yann Jonot, who formerly had the position of National Coordinator of Intelligence and the Fight Against Terrorism in France. It also turns out that some Civipol staff have circulated from Paris to Brussels, where they are taking part in administrating EU aid monies. So Civipol has had a role in European border externalization as far back as since 2003, and especially in EU policies, which also aligns with its motto: those who join us do so with the conviction that internal security is also built externally. And this very much resonates with the internal-external security nexus, which has come to guide EU policy in its southern neighborhood and beyond. So in 2018, Civipol was implementing 117 projects in 84 countries to an annual business volume of 176 million euro. And its operational and geographical focus has also then shifted towards Africa, and especially former French colonies, which in 2019 were accounting for 75% of its project portfolio. Civipol is also one of the biggest implementing partners of the EU Trust Fund for Africa, which is an EU external policy fund put down to mainstream migration management in all of EU external action. And in 2020, according to our calculations, the Civipol was implementing more than 212 million euro worth of EU aid contracts. And it also is implementing other projects from other EU external policy funds, like, for example, the instrument contributing to stability and peace. And such projects include the training of police and gendarmes to combat transnational organized crime and migrant smuggling, technical support to intelligence, customs, and border control and police, and security technology provision. It also builds biometric civil registry databases of African countries with the purpose of controlling mobility of African migrants bound for Europe. And so when I was in Bamako in Mali in 2017, I asked an EU official, why are you building such a biometric civil registries? And I got this answer. The initial thought behind these projects is if we strengthen the civil registry of African countries, it will help the EU to get access, and it will be possible to track down who is an irregular migrant. So it has a migration management component. The idea is that consulates can monitor and choose to give or not to give documents to those people. And biometric civil registries also have an envisioned function with regards to migrants in an irregular situation and to their forced return. So it's quite contested also in the host countries. So to conclude our chapter, EU external policy funds are not only used to control mobility, they are also used to revive the European security and development industries, which seem to be increasingly intertwined. It also creates new markets for security solutions, as well as dependencies in African countries' internal security sectors and lock-in effects. And it allows for revolving credit, namely the circulation of aid and capital from Europe through European companies in Africa and back to Europe, just like during colonialism and after formal decolonization. And it epitomizes the blurring of corporate and state interests, and now also EU security interests, as a continuity since early French colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. I understand that you've finished and we're not going to hear from Leonie. Okay, so we're now going to Mathias, who's going to speak on behalf of Martin and Mathias, and particularly about energy politics in Libya. So I'll hand over to Mathias now.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Please let me know if you can't see or hear me. My name is Mathias Hatleskog Tjønn. I'm a PhD fellow at the Institute of Social Research in Oslo, Norway, and I'm going to take you along for a light jog through this chapter that I had the pleasure and privilege of writing together with Martin. Martin, if you feel that I am misrepresenting us at some point, feel free to stage an emergency intervention. So the chapter is entitled Long-Term Influence of a Short-Lived Colony, Postcoloniality and Geopolitics of Energy and Migration Control in Libya. In short, it's safe to say that Libya has been very central to discussions of European migration control in recent years, which is part of our rationale for doing this. However, the focus that is often seen reproduces a kind of ahistorical, presentist and Eurocentric gaze, where Libya is seen as a quote-unquote failed transit state in constant crisis, with European-led migration control and necessary means to impose order upon such crises. Now, in contrast, we attempt to show that colonial infrastructures and power relationships did not end at Libyan independence, but can be found in the country's forced migration dynamics and its European involvement today. So we are sort of attempting to provide a historical corrective to the presentism that is often seen through a post-colonial gaze at Italian, Libyan, and also Turkish histories of colonialism and imperialism that are quite often relegated to the periphery of post-colonial studies. So moving through our chapter section by section, I'll just first, before I get to that, I'll just say briefly that in our chapter, we relied on sort of a mix of primary archival resource material from a couple of Italian archives, as well as treaty texts, Italian-Libyan, and a whole slew of secondary literature and media sources. So the first section called Reimagining Rome on the Fourth Shore, Forced Displacement and Settler Colonialism. I should say that the fourth shore here is a reference to the fascist Italy's idea of a greater Italy, where Libya constituted the fourth shore as an integral part of greater Italy. However, that did not mean that they bestowed Libyans with the same rights as other Italian citizens. So the starting point for our article is the Italian occupation of Libya after a fairly brief war with the then Ottoman Empire. The colonial occupation itself lasted from 1911 through 1943, and quite quickly after the Italian occupation, the need for territory and water resources to create what was called a spazio vitale, or a living space, similar to the National Socialist German term Lebensraum. Those two territory and water were seen as necessary to satisfy Italian settler colonial visions. Now, interestingly enough, the water drilling coincidentally also brought the first finds of oil, which brought oil pioneering or oil exploration by the Italian company Agip, which later forms Eni, which I'll get back to. And now it's also worth mentioning that both of these goals of securing territory and water resources required a quote-unquote cleansing of the lands of their local Libyan populations, and instead turning these populations of Libyans into a sedentary and dependable workforce. This was met with fierce and continued resistance that continued well into the early 1930s. It's also very important to note. Now, in this cleansing of the land, control, mass displacement, and brutal erasure was facilitated by a particular fusion of racialized and industrial capitalist logics. And the colonial practices that Italian colonizers put into place in Libya forcibly removing people, putting them into internment camps, etc., can be seen as forming a historical backdrop of sorts to today's migrant detention camps that are found many times in the same coastal areas of Libya. Moving on. So in our second section, we looked specifically at Eni, which is an Italian super major oil company, one of the 8th largest, I think it's the 7th largest in the world. And its relationship to both colonial history and Libya. So after 1943 / after World War II, as remnants of the Italian settler colonial regime left or were forced out, instead a new economic system of joint Italian-Libyan oil extraction involving Eni followed. And this was built on preceding financial colonial domination by Italy and Italian companies. I think it's important here to say that the interesting thing, well, one of many interesting things about Eni's role is that they actually positioned themselves as a force for decolonization, saying that they would help colonies, former colonies like Libya, gain financial autonomy by offering better terms and sort of providing different economic avenues, which is in stark contrast to the fact that the company Eni itself was built upon Egypt, which I mentioned in my previous in the previous slide, had conducted the first oil searches in Libya during colonial times. Now, towards the end of the 20th century, when displacement politics and practices reappeared as sort of primary dominant Italian-European geopolitical interests in the region, this led to a new phase in the discursive use of the country's colonial history, where it was again repurposed as a way of talking about other things like resource extraction and migration management, which I will get to in the next slide, entitled Libya, EU's Gatekeeper. Now, what we discussed in this section is that the growing focus on Libya as a locus for European forced migration politics involved the EU making strategic appeals to Libyan post-coloniality. This, interestingly enough, completely ignored the EU's sort of roots in colonial history itself, where several of its founding members were colonial states at the time. It also is telling that in a whole range of documents that has been written under EU auspices, the colonial history of a lot of its actors, such as Italy and Libya, is completely ignored or not mentioned at all. However, in a very interesting instance where it is mentioned is the Italian-Libyan Friendship Treaty from 2008, which did bring a linkage between colonialism, petroleum extraction, and migration. It also included an apology, which I'll discuss briefly, and promises of colonial reparation. However, this apology is interesting in that it never mentions what exactly is apologized for. And the colonial reparations are, in a sense, more sort of money that was raised through taxing the companies, Italian companies operating in Libya, and then oftentimes going to or earmarked for infrastructure that would in turn make these Italian companies better positioned within the country's extraction regime. In general, I think it's safe to say that although the 2008 Friendship Treaty did bring a very important expansion of migration management, it did not do so by reflecting seriously upon why it is so that a string of Italian companies had remained central actors in Libya both before and after nominal decolonization, and have continued to keep a very strong presence in energy supply and border control. So, bringing Turkey into the mix. Now, obviously, Turkey didn't enter into Libyan politics in 2010-2011. As mentioned previously, the predecessor to Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, had controlled the territory when Italy attacked and colonized it in 1911. But yes, in the interest of time and sticking with our progression here, I think it's important to mention that the Arab Spring and the upheaval that followed resulted in new alliances, which in a sense inaugurated the quote-unquote return of Turkey to the former Ottoman provinces, which reconfigured discursive tropes on Libyan post-coloniality. Now, what happened here is that, in short, Italy and Eni were primarily interested in safeguarding their installations, their financial positions in Libya. And so when the eastern-based Libyan warlord Khalifa Haftar threatened to, at some point, threatened to take over power in Tripoli, Libya's capital, Italian officials and oil company officials started sort of opening up the possibility of negotiating with them to sort of safeguard their installations, which in turn then enraged the GNA, or the Government of National Accord, which is the internationally acknowledged government in Libya. And they turned, in a sense, to Turkey for aid, which then pitted the two former Libyan imperial powers against each other. In the end, the GNA, with Turkish backing, managed to fight off the challenge, and this, in a sense, also brought Turkey in a whole new way into discussions about, in Italian media, for instance, about Turkey having infiltrated Libyan border control policies and taking Libyan displacement from sort of the area of control of EU member states, and primarily Italy, that they've kind of taken the onus here, in a sense. So I won't read off this quite extensive conclusion. I'll just try to succinctly say what Martin and I attempted to do here. And again, Martin, feel free to join in at some point if you have anything to add. What we tried to do was to tell the specific and often suppressed history of how colonialism has shaped Italian, Libyan, EU and Turkish relationships on migration and mobility control. And furthermore, how this colonial history still suffuses modern day dealings within the same fields. Sometimes directly, as in the history of company links I mentioned between Ajip and Eni. Oftentimes indirectly through this colonial history being repurposed or instrumentalized to enable other conversations, be they on mobility control or on energy extraction. So I'll try to finish a bit ahead of time to allow more time for conversation. Thank you very much, and I'll turn back to Lucy.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to move to our final presentation, and just a reminder that you can ask questions following this to any of the speakers. So I believe that Rosanne is presenting for Rosanne and Sharla, but we didn't have time to check that all the technicalities were all in order for Rosanne. So hopefully you can unmute yourself, Rosanne, and we can see that everything's okay.
Yeah, Sharla and I were going to split the time, if that's okay. Yeah.
Great. That's fantastic.
Yeah, so it's so we just shared a text, and I said, maybe I have 7 or 8 minutes, and then she's got 5 to 7, so that's about 15, even if we're wrong. Thank you all for the launch, for the event, to the editorial team, to Martin for putting together a conference. I teach African American and Caribbean history in the United States, which I've done for 20 years. I've worked on British policing of so-called illegal slave trading for most of that time. I've worked in Black studies and Latin American studies, and this collaboration has been without question the one that was the most committed to both working across actual borders in terms of where we're all located, where we're working, and where our work is situated, and across disciplines. And so it's been a really rich experience for me, to which I'm grateful. I had slides late, and I didn't know the format, and I was late for everything, but there you have it. I wanted to talk about the chapter that I did with my co-author, Sharla Fett, who has worked on U.S. suppression of so-called illegal slave trading in the 1800s. And one of the things that we were just talking about in our sort of, about this presentation is where the United States actually fits as a colonial, as a rising, I gave it permission long ago. There you go. And did that work? Yeah, I gave it permission when I came on first, but I guess it went to sleep, the permission. But also where the United States fits in as a part of the global North. And in my own case, working on the UK, 20 years ago, when I first started working on slave trade suppression, it's not that I was not talking to social scientists, but the social scientists I talked to mostly directed me and said, well, these Africans who were rescued, the common language, from illegal slave ships, perhaps you can compare them to literatures on the sort of cultural and social memory of other immigrants of the 1800s and beyond. And so that you compare Africans who were taken from illegal slave ships between most of the 1830s and the 1860s with other 19th century immigrants, with Irish and Italian crossing the Atlantic, to North America, this kind of thing. Were they able to maintain community? What was their folklore? And this sort of thing. And it was completely divorced, as Martin noted, from until relatively recent work. With Jenny Martinez and Maeve Ryan, sort of trying to link a longer thread of colonial studies to sort of the modern so-called human rights regimes. It is not the case that sort of people were just tied up in looking at slave trade suppression as a humanitarian project. But when they critiqued the project, they focused mostly on questions that came from slavery studies. That is, did Africans who were rescued from illegal slave transport, did their lives end up substantially better than people who were enslaved, especially in places where slavery still existed? And there was this sort of anchoring backwards into slavery studies. And those are important questions about labor history, and ones that I like. What is refreshing about this volume is, the work of Martin and others in bringing this 19th century conversation into modern migration studies, is to look at the 19th century suppression of the slave trade as intimately connected to, at least in the way sort of Sharla and I thought about our piece, at least 3 big colonial projects that arguably continue to the day. We only have to look at the news to know that they continue today. The first one of those is Europe, and especially Britain's expansion as global colonial powers, and the naturalizing of that in how the world is ordered. All right, and that slave trade suppression wasn't just something related to the ending of slavery. It was related to a particular kind of colonial expansion and world power. I think the second colonial project, and the one that's most central to this volume, is the Europe and the rising U.S. of themselves as self-appointed, essentially policemen, not only of their own borders, but of global borders and of population movement. that this wasn't just about their capacity to seize territory and claim it for economic exploitation, but it was the birthing of a system that that we see, and that my the co-authors in this volume, the other essays, show, is really this idea and the claiming of an incredible, the powers of border control situated in certain governments. The third colonial project that we sort of try to link slave trade suppression to is this issue of population management and surveillance. That what the role of particularly European government, of colonial governments, is to manage populations through their constant sort of documenting of who they are, and that there's no way to decouple their surveillance of those populations with management. So my bit of the chapter then is about mutiny that occurs among Africans who had been taken from illegal slave ships and drafted into the British Army, straight from slave ships. And I'll say a little bit more about what's wrong with that as a project in general. One piece around this mutiny that ended up a lot shorter in the article that I wanted was that there's lots of discussion of precisely what we've been talking about. There's a lot of Africanists in this edited volume. And although this mutiny happens in the Caribbean, at the time, colonial officials, they are engaged in a very self-congratulatory discussion of their expanding power in Africa. What was Africa like? What are African people like? What are African groups like culturally? And real debates over, not that this is a crazy abusive use of a population to conscript them in this way, but we've just got to figure out if we understand Africans and we can manage them better and prevent mutinies occurring. Not that there might be something fundamentally wrong or at fault with the way we've essentially dragooned them into this army. And this sort of endless discussion. It's the thing, I think it's the biggest bit that I cut down, of European expertise. And this was the beginning of the mid-1800s building of European claims, not just to territory, but to knowledge. These West India regiments that the Africans ended up in were a part of a much larger project of literally organizing and regimenting and civilizing Africans as a part of their imperial project. Kyle Prochnow has just finished PhD at Waterloo, I think, is working on a sort of a monograph length study that that if you look at the presence of Black soldiers in these British West India regiments, that this is a sort of textbook of a century of a certain kind of exploitation project. The other thing that's going on here is that Great Britain is very much in the business of building a transatlantic colonial sphere, of which these Africans in the Caribbean are a part, and slave trade suppression, far from being this sort of good humanitarian project, is in fact a part of something else. Watching my time, where this plays out is in the Eastern Caribbean, and the policing of the slave trade was heavily on the African coast, but also on the eastern and northern edges of the Caribbean. And the other part of this is an important observation that Martin really opened my eyes to, that this is very much also a precursor to the way who gets to, by dint of either having naval power or asserting the right to do so, essentially to police illegal boat transport. And one of the things that's shocking about the mutiny that I cover is that the Africans who are taken into the British Army are taken off of a Portuguese slave ship. They're first then taken under British control to one island and then moved to another where Britain needs them for military, or views them as having a useful purpose for military use. And so they're literally taken from a Portuguese vessel deemed to be illegal. To be taken into Portuguese enslavement in Brazil is an illegal act, but to be taken into British military service is a legal act, and one that is going to civilize you. This plays out, the mutiny is unsuccessful, unsurprisingly, with the sort of the force that could be exercised against it. In terms of the way it's memorialized and how we think about this as a critical part, not of Britain taking humanitarian and global leadership, but of the sort of force of colonial ideas and the claiming of certain kinds of authority. On the one hand, there is in 1970s Trinidad a political leader, a Black nationalist, who takes the name of the leader of the mutiny. to emphasize a long anti-colonial struggle. But more to the point, the town of St. Joseph, where the mutiny occurred, a big part of its current public history identity, which is in part tied to tourism, but also tied to what I think Trinidadians would deem a certain kind of post-colonial national pride, is that they hailed the town as the first colonial capital. And the very idea that at the site of this very important anti-colonial mutiny, and a real critique to the colonial and long post-colonial project, that there's still this kind of odd celebration of an early colonial capital. But I will sort of pass off to Sharla to talk about where the United States comes in as a sort of not yet massive colonial power, but certainly one building. Thank you.
Do we have Sharla?
I did speak to her right before I started speaking to make sure we had our time correct.
Yes, I can see that her microphone is on. Oh, and now she's reconnecting, so I wonder if there's a connection problem. Let's just give it a minute. Sharla, you're back. And I can see that your microphone is on. Oh. She's gone again now. I think there's a kind of connection problem. There seem to have been lots of people leaving and coming again during the session. Are you able to say anything?
I can't. Yeah, I can, and in fact, because we've been talking about the transition when we first started the writing together. On the one hand, these things are very similar. There are Africans who are claimed to be rescued from the slave trade, saved by whatever authority, but are then very quickly conscripted into these colonial projects. And one of the, at first we wondered whether we had to treat the US case as exceptional, because it's not yet the global colonial power it would become. And also in the case of Liberia, this is a colony that by the time slave trade suppression takes off is controlled mostly by African Americans. But I think we've got Sharla now, who can take over that bit of it.
Okay, do you hear my voice now? Hello?
Yes.
I think my camera is on. Okay, good. I had the same experience where I gave all the permissions, but then it forgot while I was in the listening audience. So hello, everyone. And I'm just going to try to pick up on where Rosanne left off, and I will shorten my comments on my appreciation, though I do really need to say how energizing and just really beautiful it was to work with all of these editors and with my co-author Rosanne Adderley, especially echoing Eva over these challenging months, and to be able to create intellectual community across borders while we were isolated was energizing, and it's lovely to see this book out in print. In 2017, I published a book about African captives who were rescued from illegal slave ships by the US Navy. And I had explored in a limited way some work on refugee studies scholarship to help me think about experiences of encampment and forced migration. But it really was with this generous group of scholars that first in the workshop in Denmark organized by Martin, and then in all these collaborative conversations around editing the chapters that I was pushed in to think in new ways about the reciprocal benefits of this kind of interdisciplinary engagement with post-colonial theory and with the value of historical context and historical legacies for contemporary studies of forced migration. So I think where Rosanne was in the discussion was trying to think about the US as a counterpoint, because in some ways the British Empire is the, you know, the big planet, and the US is maybe the moon circulating that, because the scale of US slave trade suppression was so much smaller. But the two cases really shared striking commonalities of the racialized logics, racial hierarchies in thinking about the so-called benefits of being, again, rescued by these two nations, and then also the humanitarian rhetoric that was used. But at the same time, a real difference with the US is that the US was employed in this humanitarian venture of resettling slave trade refugees, while it was also defending chattel slavery domestically, because chattel slavery persisted, of course, through the Civil War in the United States. So what my part of this chapter was looking at the late 50s, when there is a peak in the US Navy's efforts on the high seas. And so those Africans who are taken in off of these slave ships during that time faced a hostile and actually a legal barrier to entering the United States, because US law mandated the removal. This was a kind of historical form of externalization, because Black freedom was so politically volatile in the United States that the law of slave trade suppression required the removal of recaptives. And that removal site was Liberia. And this is where I think the Liberian militia enlistment becomes very complicated, because recaptive Africans mostly from West Central Africa, not from the Liberian area, were resettled in Black American settler households and then enlisted in the settler militias. So these settler militias then are seen, the settler militias were engaged with conflicts with local indigenous groups. And the recaptive African resettlement was an infusion to the settler demography to help with that population and those men and boys who are enlisted in the militias or are employed in some of these military conflicts with indigenous Liberian groups. And so there's a doubling of the legacies of US colonialism in the ways that Black Americans sought freedom and to create a free territory and to create a space, a territory for Black freedom, at the same time then that the Liberian incorporation of African recaptives are then used for their own colonial purposes as well. So it is very complicated, and added to that, part of what I explored was that militia service itself was seen as a form of vindicating to the white world, to the anti-Black world, the capacity of Liberians for Republican citizenship. And the male enlistment in militias Liberian militias were often attacked and denigrated as proof that Black American settlers could not have their own country and exercise full Republican citizenship. And Liberian militias were often held up and defended as proof that they could. And so recaptives become implicated in that. And I think that, just to close, I'll just read one sentence from trying to summarize this kind of complexity in almost a palimpsest of colonial legacies. Then Liberian militias, so recaptive Africans were then recruited into Liberian militias, which aim to ensure a free soil refuge for African descended people. But in the process, they also are defending a settler society deeply imprinted with the coloniality of power inherited from its roots in the 19th century US, albeit inherited by a racially subordinated and even for some settlers, formerly enslaved subjects from the US. And I think I should stop so that we can leave some space for questions, but this counterpoint of the US made for a very productive set of conversations between Rosanne and me as we edited this, and thought about the ways that slave trade suppression connects to the management of refugee populations, surveillance, and border controls in the present.
Fantastic. Thanks ever so much. I'm so glad that we were able to overcome all of the time zones and have you both here as well. Okay, of course, there are many other chapters in the volume, many other geographies covered. We had the first kind of 4 volunteers to speak who presented today, but do check out the book for other chapters. So I'm happy now to open up to discussion. I'm conscious that with the time in some geographies that people might start to drift out. But if you would like to ask a question, you can either put it in the chat or put your hand up in the little person with their hand up icon at the bottom middle. Perhaps while we're waiting for some questions, because it always takes people to warm up a bit, I wanted to ask all the speakers about the methodological challenges of this kind of post-colonial research, and particularly thinking about the question of legacies. So is it enough to say that something is a legacy of colonialism? And what are the strategies that you've used in your work to establish this link? And I think that's a particularly interesting question for the historians in the group as well, particularly whether that's it must be a question that you contemplate as a historian seeing the contemporary world, and how do you see that kind of the possibilities for actioning that in your work? I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to have a go at how they've dealt with this first. Any of the speakers? Otherwise I'll have to be like a teacher and nominate one of you.
I will say a quick thing, if I may, is that one of the things as a historian that's been so exciting about this collaboration, and it's a bit challenging for my own work, is that in interdisciplinary studies, at least in, there's been such a rich conversation in humanities fields, like between literature scholars, talking to historians about what post-coloniality means. And it has been really eye-opening to think about the way that the naturalization of the nation state in the second half of the 20th century, that we've just taken border control away from sort of colonial theory. And even certainly in my experience as a historian, if you engage with post-coloniality, they're like, oh, well, that's more literary studies kind of thing. And you're kind of, it's an ideological thing, not something that actually relates to practice. And that's the contemporary social scientists in this volume really have really, I think, opened something up that I really hope will influence historians. I think in part because there is now a conversation talking about how anti-Blackness is sort of translated into policy over time, but that conversation is equally well appropriate for thinking about sort of how sort of coloniality is enacted continually in the present. And I think people are resistant to it precisely because we claim that colonialism is over.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Rosanne. Did anybody else want to follow on from that or offer any comments on the kind of methodological challenges of thinking about legacies? Mathias.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. Thank you, everyone, indeed. I wanted to just briefly say that, well, one of the challenges we had in this was that there was, through my MA work, there was archival resources and archival primary material that we looked at in the Italian Libyan case, but not so much in, or not at all, rather, in the Turkish Libyan case. So what Martin and I kind of attempted to do instead was look at how the colonial history formed a sort of legacy, not in how it kind of had shaped the history of the actors necessarily, but how the history also was reinvented and repurposed, be it in Italian-Libyan relations or in Turkish-Libyan relations. And again, Martin, feel free to jump in here. He has already preempted me there.
Yeah, Martin, chip in.
I hope you can see me now and hear me. Yes, but actually, I think you put it quite well, Mathias. So it was not a comment to your point, but it was to also speak a little bit on behalf of Phil, who did not present, but he has a great chapter that involves political theory and political philosophy, because in that very different discipline, there's also a methodological challenge that I share, because I myself come from a philosophy background and have a PhD in political philosophy. And there is Phil himself, I'm praising him sort of without him having a chance to defend himself, but he did a very important work in 2000 called The Philosophies of Exclusion, parts of which was asking the question about how philosophers had engaged with the colonial encounter in their civilizational and sort of, grand schemes. And as it turns out, they hadn't. And others have also since then talked about Kant and his relationship to colonialism, or Hegel. And actually, so there's a very nascent literature there, but methodologically speaking, this goes at the heart of which is perhaps a very controversial claim for many philosophers, which is that you need to also look at the settings and the biographies of the philosophers in shaping their thoughts. So, for instance, there's an old book called The Utilitarians and Empire. Such questions need to be asked methodologically, because there's a lot of, I think, to be gained, a lot of value in post-colonial reckoning to be gained in this very different discipline than history, namely political theory and philosophy.
Thank you. Sharla.
I think in the spirit of raising up chapters that are not, my video is not working, so I'm just going to leave it off. The spirit of raising chapters that aren't represented by the authors, in thinking about the creative methodologies of this volume, Martin's comments and the decentering of only Eurocentric frames of analysis, the chapter on the practice of sanctuary and refugee protection in India, where Nasreen Chowdhury and Shamna Poyal talk about hospitality and sanctuary as indigenous concepts in India. And so I think part of the methodologies of this chapter is to go where she's looking not only at European and Eurocentric ideas of sanctuary and hospitality, but also in Sanskrit or Sundiata couplets from African epics or other Indian-based indigenous forms of thinking religiously and spiritually about sanctuary. So this doesn't answer your question so much about the continuities of how we prove historical legacies, but it does address the expansion of the types of materials we're using to think through these issues of historicity.
Yeah, thank you, Sharla. Okay, so in the chat, Lucy's asked, I don't know if this is a question from the audience that's been sent privately or Lucy's own question, but why have post-colonial perspectives been lacking in migration studies? I guess we would all think that's related to the sanctioned ignorance of histories of colonialism, the denial of that we live in a colonial, post-colonial world. But do any of the presenters want to speak to that specifically? And now I can see Eva's microphone is on, and there's also a question for Eva there to speak about the role of corruption then and now in the doors of revolving actors and credit.
Yes, okay, so I'm not sure if I will speak exactly about corruption, but I want to say like what our challenges were as non-historians, also trying to pinpoint these colonial legacies, because we struggled a lot with this, like how can you actually, if something happened before, like how can you, and it's something is similar today, it's not necessarily a continuity from the past, right? So how do we deal with this? And I think for us, the way that we solved that was also to look for something quite specific, right? The blurring of state and corporate interests and how that quite specifically manifested in different areas of time. And since we didn't know exactly where to look, we had to look through quite a lot of historical material and secondary historical sources to find something out about that. How did actually the relationship between the French state and companies manifest in colonialism in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in like after decolonization? So yeah, we definitely had to read quite a lot. So yeah, and I also realized how we are working very differently from historians, right? Because we took a very broad view from early French colonialism, late 15th century until today, which is the enormous historical period, which is not how historians tend to work quite specifically on specific historical points in time. And I think I will also challenge you, Lucy, to say something about your chapter, because you solved this in an incredibly interesting and intelligent way. Also, how you've been dealing with this in even geographies of disease transmission. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how deeply successful I was in my chapter, but certainly this is a question that I have thought about a lot in my own work. And as you say, there are methodological questions around whether you're taking an event, a particular event in history, and kind of making a case that this has in serious ways shaped something in the contemporary moment, for example, a legal change or something, but also then other approaches where you kind of trace a logic or an idea across time through kind of punctuated moments, and you see this logic popping up in all of these key moments in history that you then kind of pull into the present. And I think it is really important to say, like, a kind of, in that sense, thinking in a post-colonial way isn't about a kind of ideological political orientation. It's about saying, no, quite literally, the present in empirically provable, identifiable ways is fundamentally shaped. I don't just think it is because it's politically convenient to me. It's literally the history that shaped the country which I live in, and many countries in the world in really significant ways. Yeah, in my particular chapter, I kind of did more of like a panning effect. I mean, I guess I was building a kind of argument about the kind of rhetoric of particular kinds of mobility being seen as problematic and to be curtailed, when in fact, when we look at disease transmission, it's the mobility of very privileged people who, which often kind of leads to these kinds of big disease events. And I was writing that right in the middle of the pandemic, and I guess kind of it was a sort of act of catharsis at some of the kind of discourses that we were seeing, and refugee boats being stopped in the Mediterranean, etc. I see as another question, which I think this is a really good question for Nina, if you're willing to speak, Nina, on the role of gender in the case of Mayotte. I wonder if you can put your mic on.
Yes.
Yes, I agree with her if people would be willing to put their their cameras on.
Yes, thank you for this question. So yes, actually the focus of my research was very much also on gender, because it was initially so it was in the framework of this broader ERC project, EU Border Care, for which I was a postdoctoral researcher. We were working at different European borders, and the focus was really on pregnant women's access to healthcare. So gender was very much part of it, and in the context of Mayotte, gendered assumptions, gender representation play a huge role, because Mayotte has been caught up in kind of post-colonial politics of the reproduction of a nation, in a way, in the sense that undocumented Comorian women are very much stigmatized as this woman coming to Mayotte to give birth to French children. Of course, it's not that simple and it's not so straightforward. These children do not access automatically French citizenship, etc. But at the level of a political discourse, they have very much become the target of this type of stigmatization. And this has led to the French government actually changing its nationality laws in 2018. Even though there are many already exceptions, so to say, about Mayotte, this was kind of a major turn because it touched on the nationality laws, which are normally constitutional. So the Constitutional Council had to give an opinion about that, but they actually supported the change, arguing for the exceptional circumstances of Mayotte. So again, this idea of exceptionality. And the change was about requiring for children born in Mayotte that their parents were there legally for at least 3 months, for them to access French citizenship as teenager later on. And now it's again on top, like, you know, in the headlines, because in August this year, the Interior Minister proposed to kind of toughen this condition and change it from 3 months to at least 1 year of legal residency, so that children can access French citizenship in the future. But all of these political discussions are actually based on this racialized and gendered representations about this Comorian woman coming to give birth to Mayotte. But what I was trying, my research was qualitative, so of course it's 40 interviews. It's hard to make a statistical case, but very clearly in the interviews I have conducted, women who were there for a long period of time, many years, and what was difficult for them was to access regularization. So it's not women who have just arrived yesterday and came to give birth. It just happens at some point to be pregnant and give birth, but the day they come to the hospital, healthcare professionals cannot say they have arrived yesterday or they have arrived 5 years earlier, because usually there is also a language barrier. So all of this feeds into this type of representation, but actually it's much more complicated in terms of their life trajectories, and usually they're much more anchored in Mayotte than this type of representation suggests.
Thank you. I wonder if we could bring Clayton in, who we haven't heard from yet. I wonder, Clayton, if you could talk a bit about the methods that you used in your project, and if you kind of went into that thinking of it as a project that would be about understanding the legacies of colonialism, or if that was something you kind of came upon during your fieldwork.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, so I'm certainly not a historian, and really these questions of kind of history and legacies of colonialism unfortunately came up in analysis a lot, kind of after doing a lot of interviews, and so so I have some regret. There's so many questions I would have loved to have asked, or even if I ever could land funding to do more life histories, because so methodologically, as the space of asylum is constricting in Tanzania, that was kind of foremost in people's minds, rather than kind of interrogating how it's changed, although it came up a bit. And so so in analysis, and kind of going through workshops like these, it really became clear that these histories are kind of cyclical, repetitive, and aren't just exceptional at this moment, but are really dictated by histories of colonialism and labor, especially. So methodologically, and even the question that Martin and others address because I haven't gone into the archives. And even so, I kind of look at how does colonialism kind of set forces in motion rather than these very specific genealogies that, like Eva in their presentation showed well. So sorry, I'm a bit all over the place, but to sum it up, I wish I could have had more opportunity or more training. I think it would have enriched my project, and I've kind of done it on the back end. But moving forward, I would like to think more holistically about it.
I think this is an interesting question that follows up from that, Rosanne, and kind of following on also from the Audrey Poyle mention of that chapter earlier, about whether you came across any kind of indigenous, or I don't know if that's the right word, or local concepts in the Tanzanian case that are applicable to these area that you're looking at, with many kind of waves of refugees or migrants across borders that are then created by colonial powers. Was that something that came up in your research at all?
So I mean, again, this I guess is kind of a separate question. It kind of brings in, you know, the coloniality of my positionality, you know, as a non-indigenous researcher or non-African researcher. So I spoke intermediate level Swahili, which isn't sufficient really to dig into these concepts in depth without kind of altering the project a lot. But other people have done work on this, specifically in Swahili. I don't speak any Kirundi, which is the main language of Burundians, but linguistically in Tanzania, really kind of how Tanzanians are perceived and treated, or excuse me, how refugees are perceived and treated throughout really since colonialism and independence was shaped by Swahili. So like during the anti-settler struggles that Nyerere really fought against, of a lot of freedom fighters from South Africa, Mozambique, the surrounding areas, they were welcome as guest, or wageni in Swahili, whereas later on, after independence, a lot of Burundians and Rwandans were given the term. I'll have to get back to you on it, but that kind of denoted more of a humanitarian, more of a like a settler kind of exploited. It wasn't a friendship relationship. It was more of it kind of reflected the geopolitical shiftings as kind of a more keep your distance and even exploitable population. But that's secondarily, that's not from my own findings. But thank you for the question, Rosanne.
Okay, I can see we're starting to lose people with the time. So can I invite people, if they have anything that they would like to share towards the end, maybe particularly thinking that this question of why potentially a post-colonial perspective has been lacking in migration studies. I think Martin has something to say about that. Anything else that you would like to comment in the 9 minutes or so left? Anybody go first, just put yourself forward.
Yeah, should I try my hand at this? Yeah, because of course that's a crucial question from Lucy Potter. But I think it's safe to say that, just like Clayton pointed out, and I was just having a conversation with other research colleagues, and the post-colonial dimension keeps on and kept on popping up. Also in my own work earlier on, where for all kinds of constraints and reasons, it wasn't addressed. Oftentimes also journal reviewers see it as a question of history. Why are you diverging off into something that's not relevant for the present case? Just one case in point. But really, it's an elephant in the room, given most of the colonial histories that have shaped some of the territories where there are mass displacements. But there's also another dimension, which I think is very important to point out. That's the political economy of refugee and forced migration studies, which since its inception has been quite inextricably linked to humanitarian actors and the aid economy. And also now, of course, we cannot really speak about major research projects at a university level without also naming it a political economy. So this speaks into also, Clayton, your point on the researcher positionality, because it has been called an extractive economy. And of course, that's also one of the barriers that a researcher researching displaced persons, but thinking through a humanitarian lens, that's already always embedded within colonial matrices of power and belonging or displacement. So that's one thing. And then basically it touches upon the larger disciplinary barriers that's also affecting refugee and forced migration studies, which is of course comprised of many disciplinary interventions, because all through for instance, anthropology, geography, I mentioned law also earlier, each of these disciplines have been engaged and almost cyclically in very huge showdowns as to their own role in how their own disciplines were created through colonial encounters. So really the barriers that means why refugee and forced migration studies have had an issue tackling postcoloniality. It's on several levels. Some are disciplinary, but some have also to do with the political economy of refugee and forced migration studies itself.
Thank you. Are there any other interventions that the presenters would like to make? I will take that as a no. And we've had almost our 2 hours now, so I want to thank Martin, the kind of main editor of this volume, who organised the original workshop, and all of the contributors who've spoken today. I know that Martin's interested also in having some future events with other contributors, if you can get different people to present on different aspects of the book. But for now, just to flag again that we have many events in the Migration Research Group at the University of Sheffield. Everybody is welcome to attend. And yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Lucy, for organizing.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Lucy.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all again.
Great to see you all again.